This is a common criticism of Quebec, that it resists Canadian multiculturalism, and to a certain extent that's true, so let's talk about it. The first thing we have to understand is that Canada isn't a truly multicultural country, and in fact most Canadians probably wouldn't want it to be either. In a truly multicultural society, any citizen would have the same social, economic, and political opportunities, regardless of their cultural background or purely cultural practices. In a perfectly multicultural Canada, for instance, a Persian Canadian, let's say, who only speaks Persian, no English, and has no knowledge or practice of any Western cultural standards or norms, should be expected to have all the same social, economic, and political opportunities as any other Canadian. In practice, that's obviously not the case in Canada, and I don't think that's what most Canadians mean when they say they want multiculturalism. Canada is a country that has what you might call secondary multiculturalism. That means there's a dominant culture, English Canadian culture, and other cultures can certainly exist and thrive in local community pockets, but they're always secondary to the dominant Canadian culture. And that's where it can become a problem, particularly for French Canadians in Quebec. Because Canadian multiculturalism, at least in its current form, threatens to reduce the French Canadian cultural identity to being just another secondary cultural identity under the dominant English Canadian one. And for French Canadians, particularly in Quebec, that was never the deal with Canada. If you look at Canada's founding document, the Constitution of 1867, it couldn't be clearer that the intent was for French Canadian and English Canadian culture to be equal to one another. The promise of Canada made to French Canadians was that English Canadians and French Canadians were going to share the country together as political, social, economic, and cultural equals. That was the deal, and since then, Quebec has been trying to hold Canada to it. With the current form of Canadian multiculturalism, English Canada is changing that deal. It's going back on the promise that Canada made to French Canadians. So you can probably understand why Quebec is resisting it. Now, it's important to note that despite what you might have heard, Quebec is not closed to any other culture existing within Canada, or even within Quebec. Quebec has a different model of multiculturalism called interculturalism, which operates in a different way to Canadian multiculturalism. Under interculturalism, there is a single primary culture of a given society that everyone is expected to share. But instead of only being practiced in secondary community settings, all other cultures are free to add to and modify the primary culture that exists within Quebec. That's why, for example, our traditional music may be sung in French, but it clearly incorporates a lot of Irish elements to it. And there are hundreds of other examples of elements from different cultures that have been grafted onto the tree of the primary culture in Quebec. And that creates a common, distinct culture that we all share, and that you're free to share too.